The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly will bring you the latest from the campaign trail. In a week when Doug Ford went to Washington, the Greens dropped their entire platform, and the Liberals and New Democrats promised to freeze post-secondary tuition. Then, Nam Kiwanuka brings you the story of a small town that helped to shape Black history across Canada. That's all next on The Agenda. Let's start with spreading the love right there. A little sugar, a little extra sugar for Valentine's Day. There we go.
Don't tell our wives that. We don't need to worry. They're not watching.
They're not watching anyway. Yeah, you don't need to worry about it. Okay, a T-shirt off the top. We are star stuff. That means what?
It's a reference, I think, initially to an old Carl Sagan line about how we are all made of matter that was created in exploding stars billions of years ago. This also happens to be a quote from the show Babylon 5. And I'm always finding new ways to bring niche science fiction interests to the show.
Star Trek, Star Wars, Babylon 5,
Jurassic Park, Battlestar Galactica.
Battlestar Galactica.
I've done a few.
You are, no, anyway, we all know this about you. My shirt today, there is a method to the madness of this shirt as well. This is a shirt for the University of Toronto Mississauga campus, yes. UTM as they call it. Professor Christopher Greenway recently invited me to go to one of his classes, political studies class, and give a speech about John Turner, about whom I wrote a book several years ago, former Prime Minister of Canada. And guess what the name of the building was where the class took place? That's number one.
Because it's the Mississauga campus, and because of the date, I think I know who.
Go ahead.
I'm going to guess a former mayor of Mississauga who is not Bonnie Crombie.
You know what? That's actually not true.
No. Okay.
You won't believe it. I was coming to her. But actually, no, because he was the former member for Peel from 1959 to 1985, It's actually in the Bill Davis building, so there is that. But, of course, today, yes, you're right. For the people watching us from Mississauga, today is Hazel McCallion's birthday. She was born on Valentine's Day 104 years ago. So I thought, in homage to Hazel, I would wear something with Mississauga on it. And, of course, any excuse to get Bill Davis's name in there, I did that too. There we go. Okay, should we follow up on a little discussion we had here last Tuesday? As you may know, we are on twice a week during the writ period, Tuesdays and Fridays. We talked about Sault Ste. Marie and why we expect the seat in Northern Ontario to be much more competitive this time because the former sitting member, Ross Romano, is not running again. The NDP are running a local city councillor named Lisa Vizot-Allen. The Liberals are running Gurwinder Dusange, who's a former Algoma University student. Not sure if he still lives in the Sioux. The PCs, despite holding the seat for the last 7.5 years, seem to have been caught flat-footed, and they have chosen Chris Scott to be their candidate. He's from Eastern Ontario. Again, unclear if he even lives in the Sioux. It was a pretty close race in 2022. The PCs only won it by 2,500 votes over the NDP. So we can bet that the NDP are looking at this seat as a potential pickup.
Yeah, and this has been chatter we've heard from other people about these issues and you know, whether the parties have managed to bring local candidates to the fore. This is apparently being discussed quite actively in Sault Ste. Marie.
We should also point out that the Northern Ontario Leaders Debate took place today, but because of our taping time, we're taping this before the debate started, so we will get you caught up on what emerged from the Northern Ontario Leaders Debate. We'll do that on our podcast next Tuesday, when we're also, of course, going to talk about the main event, which is the Leaders Debate General Interest happening in Toronto Monday night. Yes. So it'll be a debate-a-palooza show on Tuesday, I guess.
Yes, and I just wanted to add very quickly that, I really dig the Northern debate. I think we need more televised debates in Ontario politics generally. And for a while there, there was a Northern Leaders debate in 2014 that the then PC leader opted not to show up for because he didn't believe it would be beneficial for his campaign. And since 2018, there really does seem to be this consensus that all the leaders do show up for the Northern debate, and it reflects the very different context of Northern Ontario, which is something you and I have talked about on this podcast quite a bit. So I'm really glad to see this Northern debate become something that all the parties take seriously.
As the kids say today, +1. I agree. And with that, let's get off to issue one. I can't remember the last time any premier of Ontario actually left the province to travel to another country in the middle of an election campaign. But that happened this week as PC leader Doug Ford, along with a bevy of other Canadian politicians, went to Washington, D.C. to lobby against Donald Trump's tariffs. JMM, what do we think emerged from all of this?
Honestly, not a ton. The premiers clearly expressed their concerns. They did manage to get a meeting with two White House advisors to the president. But in terms of moving the needle in terms of substantive policy change, there is no evidence of that emanating from the White House. After the meeting, the Deputy Chief of Staff, James Blair, posted to X that Trump's desire to make Canada the 51st state is still on the table. And on top of that, the Trump administration has announced yet another new round of tariffs just yesterday. It's not clear yet how those will apply to Canada, but we are unlikely to be unscathed. So tariffs are still on. Talk of annexation is still on. If this trip was supposed to actually meaningfully change relations between Canada and the U.S., I see no evidence of that.
And Trump was trolling yesterday again as well when he had his little impromptu news conference in the Oval Office referring to Governor Trudeau. I spoke to Governor Trudeau earlier today.
Yes.
He's quite a troll in some respects,
Yes, that has been one of the consistent themes of his presidency.
Yeah. How about advertising?
So the Ford campaign did produce an ad about this trip to talk about their time in Washington. It shows Premier Ford at various events in Washington, D.C. He's accompanied by other cabinet ministers. Remind our listeners that they are all still cabinet ministers.
Not MPPs, but ministers.
Correct, yes. Vic Fideli and Stephen Lecce were part of this ad speaking about the economic unity between our two countries, and I believe we've got that ad, so we will take a look.
Let's focus on restoring the pride of Made in the USA and Made in Canada. Let's be unapologetic as we stand up for American and Canadian workers. Today, let's usher in the new American and Canadian century, a new golden age. Let's build Fortress Amcan. Thank you, and may God bless the people of America, and may God bless the people of Canada. Thank you so much.
So we are talking about this ad because it has become controversial. The video that we just showed is not the original version, or at least not the first version of that ad that went up. The original version at the end of the ad had the PC Party logo emblazoned at the end of it, which I believe we do also have an image of that.
We got that shot? There we go. Okay, so Protect Ontario is obviously the big slogan for the PC Party in this campaign, and that partisan slogan was on at the end of the ad originally.
Yes, they posted this ad to X with that partisan brand. Then, as people drew attention to the fact that it had that partisan branding, they pulled it. Why does that matter? The Integrity Commissioner had more or less cleared this trip to Washington, D.C., but had said that it should not be used for expressly partisan purposes. That's explicit partisan purpose in the ad. The party, as we say, did remove the ad. They have said that they did so out of an abundance of caution. But the NDP have registered a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner and are asking him to investigate that.
While the NDP leader, Mard Stiles, had something to say about this as well, I gather?
Yes, exactly. Mard Stiles did have this to say. We have a clip of what she said.
It has never been more clear that Doug Ford will do anything and everything it takes to hold on to power for power's sake. He'll keep breaking the rules. He's under RCMP criminal investigation right now for his carving up of the Greenbelt, and that won't be the last of it.
That was NDP leader Stiles up in Sudbury yesterday, where she announced her Northern Ontario platform. For her part, the Liberal leader, Bonnie Crombie, also talked about Ford's trip to Washington and about the flight the PC leader took out of Washington to come back to Canada to participate in the Northern Ontario Leaders Debate in North Bay today. So let's roll the Crombie clip.
So, he has no concern for taxpayers' dollars or the rules as laid out during election campaigns. He's misusing government resources. Like, I'd like to know who's paying for the private jet to ferry him from Washington to North Bay tomorrow to carry on an election campaign. He's misusing government dollars.
Liberal leader Crombie in Elmvale near Barrie, Ontario yesterday. Both opposition leaders really decrying what is a pretty flagrant violation of the agreed upon rules in an election campaign.
Right, and we've talked about this before, the caretaker convention that says, in effect, that the government is not supposed to use public office for private or partisan gain. These statements, of course, on the way to the northern debate. There will be that debate on Friday, as we said. There will be another one on Monday, and they're getting their punches in early. Mara Stiles had some more to say yesterday in Sudbury. I believe we've got a clip of that as well.
I think Doug Ford is scared of me. I really do. I don't know. I think he's scared of me because he never comes to question period when I'm there, and he doesn't like to answer my questions in question period. He just doesn't show up to do it. So I think it's time for him to face his fears. And I look forward to him doing that in the Northern debate and on Monday, and to answer for all of his failures.
Well, here we go. We're taking shots across the bow already. Obviously, the opposition strategy at this debate, both debates, is going to be get under Doug Ford's skin. As long as he is able to sort of be calm and rise above it all, he presents pretty well. If they can needle him and get to him and get under his skin, sometimes the bear comes out of the cage, and that's a Doug Ford that is more controversial and maybe a little less likable. So we'll watch for that. How do we talk about this next part? Okay, there was another eyebrow-raising moment for the PC campaign, which emerged yesterday. A recording of a speech that Doug Ford gave at a private campaign event, I guess 2+ weeks ago. It was on day one of the campaign. Well, that recording just emerged. And apparently Ford was in the midst of a speech. I think it was at the London Police Service or something like that.
Yeah, the Chief's dinner or something.
Chief's dinner, right. Apparently he got into quite a role on crime and called for the return of the death penalty. And actually, it was, I guess, the way he put it, which was very Doug Ford, but which could also be seen as, well, he said murderers should be sent right to Sparky, which is presumably a reference to the electric chair. The PC campaign immediately put out a statement, and the statement says...
Right. The campaign says, the Premier made a poor taste joke out of frustration for the many people affected by violent criminals out on our streets because of the federal government's broken bail system and soft on crime policies. The Premier does not support capital punishment, but rather firmly believes more needs to be done to keep violent and repeat offenders behind bars where they belong.
That statement from the PC campaign is obviously... Well, should I offer a generous interpretation here? It is inaccurate. Actually, why be generous? It's just crap. That statement is crap. The Premier obviously does support capital punishment. It was outlawed in Canada almost 50 years ago. He is entitled to support capital punishment if he wants to see it return. You might just be honest about that if that's the case. But these lines about go right to Sparky after one conviction are...
That's not an ambiguous statement.
No.
It is ironic that Ford reportedly started this speech by joking about how his campaign has told him not to go off script.
Right.
Because his handler's begging him to stay on message. And this is why, right? I think people would actually be surprised at the level of public support for the return of the death penalty in Canada. There's not a ton of polling about this because it's not like a live issue, but...
it always polls high.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the more fundamental issue here is that, this is just not the debate that the PC party wants this campaign to be about. So why is Doug Ford denying the clear meaning of what there's a recording of him saying? Because he's going to say whatever he needs to just shut this topic down as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Criminal code is a federal responsibility anyway, isn't it?
Yes. So this was the other thing he said, that he was quoted as saying that he wants the provinces to be given some kind of jurisdiction over the criminal code. And this it's one of those times where it's difficult to know what he could mean by that, because the federal, this isn't like the U.S. where, some things can be a crime in one state and not a crime in another, right? The states are able to make criminal law as well as the federal government in the U.S. In Canada, only the federal government makes criminal law. It also just sounds like a really bad idea to me.
And with that, let's get off to issue 2. Let's start off this second segment with a listener question from James Hayes. He's a professor of Building Information Modeling Lifecycle Management at Algonquin College. And he writes, Hi, Steve and John Michael. I'm wondering why you think the Ontario college crisis isn't a bigger issue in the Ontario election or just the news in general. I don't know if anyone is calling it a crisis, but I think it has become a crisis. It's clear that there will be layoffs at nearly every Ontario college, and some far more than others. The writing was on the wall for my program because of the immigration restrictions for international students, but I officially learned today that it has been cut. Cheers, James. Okay, first and foremost, James, we're sorry to hear that your program has been cut. If you get a chance, drop us a note and let us know how many students that might be affected by that, and if there's any chance maybe of bringing the program back next year. James is, of course, referring to the fact that we have a perfect storm in the post-secondary world right now. Ever since, it kind of started when the PCs took over governing Ontario in 2018. The Ford government froze tuition, which on the face of it, if you're a student, sounds like a great thing. Deals with affordability issues and so on, except that it has also had the effect of depriving colleges and universities of money that they need in order to keep offering programs and hire staff and so on. If you're paying for an education, you want to get a good education. Second, of course, the feds cut way back in offering student visas, so that has deprived the post-secondary system of even more money because, of course, those students paid 3, 4, even 5 times as much in tuition fees as domestic students did. In effect, they were sort of floating the whole system financially because provincial funding was being cut back, so the foreign students made up the difference. The result is we are seeing a system in deep, deep trouble right now. Now, this past week, NDP leader Stiles, Liberal leader Crombie, they both confirmed they would maintain the tuition freeze if they won the upcoming election, which again, on the face of it, you might think sounds good, but what are the broader implications?
Well, continuing to freeze the tuition, again, just think of how much inflation you've seen since 2018. So freezing tuition at 2018 levels is leading to larger operating deficits for schools. Tuition helps pay for programming, for staff, as we say, operations. The 3 opposition leaders have all said that they would increase the base provincial funding for colleges and universities. That is one possible way to fill the gap that is being created by the tuition freeze. But how much increased spending that comes from the province is a big question. The sector has asked for $2.5 billion. The PC government did commit, I believe, $1 billion, but that still leaves a $1.5 billion or so hole to fill, and we do not yet know how much more money will be coming.
When the announcement that the Liberals made about freezing tuition came forward, I texted an Ontario University president, and I'll just leave it like that, and you'll see why when you read his response. I said, what do you think about the effect of the freeze that's being offered here?
We should add that it's Crombie set a tuition freeze plus capping the number of international students at 10%.
Correct. And that's what this president got back to me with. Here was the text. Someone should do a quick calculation on what Bonnie's cap of a maximum of 10% international students would cost U of T. I'll start. Loss of 20,000 plus international students, paying $60,000 per student. That's $1.2 billion a year. And the president finished by saying, what a stupid effing, except not effing, clueless, random policy statement. And just to be clear, it was not the president of U of T I was texting with. We'll put that on the record there. Not going to say who it was, but it wasn't him. There have actually been some pretty thoughtful debates about this on X, which you might think is an oxymoron, but you know what? Amazing.
Possible.
It's still possible, yeah. When a reporter for QP Briefing reported that Bonnie Crombie promised to cap international student enrollment at 10% for each college and university in Ontario, Alex Usher, who is perhaps, what do we call him? He's the OG for post-secondary commentary and analysis in the country. He responded on X by saying, Liberals to post-secondary education, drop dead. But then Chris Bentley, who's a former cabinet minister in Dalton McGuinty's government, posted that the post-secondary sector, in his view, had overreached. It's grown too much by relying on foreign students that helped create that problem. It's up to incoming government, colleges and universities to develop a forward-looking, sustainable approach to funding, recognize the economic situation and get more creative than the current approach. Win the crowd, says Chris Bentley. Alex Usher came back with this. This is an effective $3 to $4 billion cut to universities and colleges. There's no creativity that gets you around this. Chris Bentley came back with post-secondary education had a significant part in causing the reduction of that source of income. Post-secondary education needs sustainable funding. My point is the traditional give us money approach is not working. Time to use a different approach. I got to say, I kind of like that exchange, It's respectful. There was information exchanged, ideas exchanged. I don't know. What do you think of it?
I am struck by, to use a word that the kids use these days, I'm struck by the similar vibes here between the post-secondary education sector and municipalities. There is basically an arithmetic problem here, as Alex Usher was alluding to there, right? There are jobs that need doing in this province, and there are bodies, whether they are colleges and universities or municipalities, there are bodies that we have created to do that work. But the province also massively constrains their ability to pay for the jobs that need doing. They have some ability to be creative, raising new money in some places, but ultimately what is required here is either for the province to show up with a big bag of its own money and say, help yourself, or to let either municipalities or colleges and universities find new ways to bring in the money. And in the case of the post-secondary system, that could mean ending the tuition freeze in municipalities. Maybe that's new forms of taxation. These things have all been debated to death. At a certain point, you just have to figure out how you're going to make the arithmetic sum.
Yeah, and I guess in fairness to the opposition parties, they've both said that they would put more money from general revenue into the post-secondary system to make up for the other funding cuts. I'm not sure how specific they've been about all of that, but anyway, to be continued. And with that, let's get off to issue 3. The Ontario Green Party has launched its entire platform. It's entitled Our Plan for Fairness. JMM, let's get to some of the highlights here.
Let's talk healthcare first, one of the most important issues in this election, any Ontario election. The Green Party would spend nearly $7 billion to expand access to primary care, reduce backlogs, increase hospital funding, hire more PSWs, and create a pharmacare agreement. On housing, they would build 2 million homes within urban boundaries. That is an important point that, of course, the Green Party does not support endless sprawl into farmers' fields. They want to see those homes built in existing urban areas. They would allow single-family homes to be divided up into multiple units, as many as 4 units province-wide, and then they would give loans to new homeowners to build affordable rental units to help pay down their mortgages. And they're, as we said, that they've got this theme of fairness in their platform on economic fairness. They are proposing something that you might like, something that has come up on this podcast before, Steve. They would stop giving hydro rebate checks to everyone in Ontario, including the wealthiest Ontarians, and they would redirect it to low and middle income earners.
I ask the finance minister about this every day, every budget day.
Yes.
I ask him this question: why are you sending checks to millionaires so they can help pay their hydro bills? And what are we? We're subsidizing to the tune of $6 to $7 billion now.
It's a lot.
Makes no sense to me, but okay, whatever. We should say Mike Schreiner's ideas end up, well, let me put it this way. Somebody tweeted at me yesterday saying, why are you giving any coverage at all to the Green Party? They're not going to be the next government. You're just, wasting everybody's time. And my attitude was, well, not necessarily. Some people contribute to public life by being the deciders. They're in government. Others by pressing the deciders to come their way on various issues, and that's what Schreiner does. Mike Schreiner is also one of those guys who actually doesn't mind if you steal his ideas. He just wants to see those ideas done. And I guess the best example was he was the first guy out there to say we should let the truckers ride on the 407 for free because it would take traffic off the 401 and it would get better usage out of a highway that's not getting much usage of right now. The NDP has signed on to that idea. So this is one way to influence the public agenda.
Yeah, part of this is that Mike Schreiner is just like a genial guy, and he's not going to mind if you steal his ideas. And some of it, he's not going to say this particularly in an election campaign, but like if, you strapped him to a chair and hit him with some truth serum, he would admit that no, the Green Party is not going to form government after this election. But as you say, the constructive role that it plays in Ontario politics is bringing forward good ideas and at least forcing other parties to either adopt them, which happens, or explain why they won't. And we are seeing both of those happen in this election. And with that, let's go to the mailbag.
Yes, indeed. We are always happy to get your feedback at this special email address, onpolitics@tvo.org. This one is from Paul. Apologies if I mispronounce your last name. It's Terrick or Terich, Terech, in Curtis, Ontario, who writes the following. Hi, Steve and John Michael. I am following my usual 4 a.m. routine, reading the morning papers, and came upon an item of some interest that probably didn't escape your notice. An NDP candidate, Natasha Doyle Merrick, withdrew from the race to make the riding a more focused race and endorsed a Liberal candidate. It reminded me of a column Steve penned within the last year. My question is, are there any consequences from a party or Elections Ontario for a candidate who does this? There should certainly be some recognition for someone who displays such courage. It plainly shows that vote splitting is not a successful option. It's always interesting to hear your take on this. Paul Terrick from Curtis, Ontario. Paul, thanks so much for noticing this. Yes, I did do a column about this many months ago because the column emerged from the notion that in our first past the post system, if the non-conservative parties insist on splitting the anti-Ford vote, then in a first past the post system, Ford is likely going to win again.
Yeah.
And the NDP candidate, the NDP, this incidentally takes place in Eglinton Lawrence riding.
Yes.
And the NDP almost always only gets about 10% of the vote there. So they're never a threat to win, but they're certainly a threat to take away votes from the Liberal candidate who might need those votes to win. So here's what, I think we've got this here, right? Let's put this up here. The statement from the NDP candidate on social media reads, I recognize the race in Eglinton Lawrence is a clear two-party contest between Liberals and Conservatives. To prevent a Conservative win and more years of neglect, I'm stepping aside to avoid a vote split. So she's basically doing what I suggested, if the opposition were serious about defeating Ford, they could do province-wide. But it's happened only in one riding here.
Yes. So the NDP will not have a full slate of candidates this election. It turns out actually neither will the Liberals. They lost a candidate in Windsor West, though we are told that is a family emergency situation. This Eglinton Lawrence situation, I think it really shows how things would be different if we had a proportional or a ranked balloting system. People could vote for the parties that they want without necessarily worrying about the effect of splitting the vote. Or in this case, this NDP candidate could have stayed on the ballot. Can I perhaps offer an unpopular opinion, maybe one that Paul would disagree with? I'm not sure this is the right way to do this thing. I understand what the candidate or former candidate is aiming to do, but from another perspective, let me put it this way, this is also, the NDP, I think, would see this as basically fraudulent, right? This person stayed on the ballot, stayed as the listed candidate until the very last moment, dropped off the ballot, giving the NDP...
Before the deadline, though.
Well,
so there's no penalty, and her name will not be on the ballot.
Well, but my point is that the NDP were also given no chance to replace her with somebody who was willing to stay on the ballot, right? So Paul asked, is there any consequences from Elections Ontario? No, there's no consequence there. Consequences from the party? Well, I imagine this person is not going to be on the NDP ballot in the future.
No, and it's a fair point to say that if you're one of the on average 10% over the last many elections. If you're one of the 10% who wanted the option of voting NDP in Eglinton Lawrence, that option is not there for you now.
Yes.
And, I'm inferring here, but the 10% of people who probably were going to vote NDP on the 27th, when's the election day again?
February 27th.
On the 27th of February, they will not any longer have that option.
Yeah.
But if the idea is to defeat Doug Ford, which is what the New Democrats say they want to do,
yes,
this is one way to do it in our first past the post system.
And given the restraints of the system, I think this is like the only way to do it. I also imagine there are a bunch of NDP people who are crossing this person off their Christmas card list.
Yeah, I bet that's true too. A shame to acknowledge that on Valentine's Day, but there we go.
Yes.
Why don't you give the email address one time and we'll get out of here.
Absolutely. If you would like to ask about any content on the show, you can please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, February 14th, 2025. Again, happy Valentine's Day to everyone.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
We always like to thank the crew for making the set look so good for our video podcast. And remember, the Leaders Debate will happen Monday night, 6:30 p.m. We will tackle all the issues that emerge from that debate on our regular podcast on Tuesday. So until then, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
In her new book, In the Light of Dawn, The History and Legacy of a Black Canadian Community, author Marie Carter shares the story of how a small rural Ontario town helped to shape Black history across the country. She's joined by Afua Cooper, Professor of History and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto Scarborough, and leading expert in Black Canadian Studies who wrote the foreword to the book, and they're both with us in studio. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
This book is so detailed, so dense. Marie, we were having a conversation about how long it must have been to do the research, and reading it, myself and the producer, so much history in this book that I was like, I never knew this. I never learned this in school. And Marie, in the introduction of the book, you actually write that you wanted to be careful with how you wrote this story of the Dawn settlement, that you didn't want to be an apologist or to cause any pain. As a historian, why was it important to acknowledge that? And what did you mean by that?
Well, I think it's a really, as a white historian writing Black history to begin with, I'm aware of the sensitivity of that. I'm also very aware of being rooted in the community I'm writing about. And a lot of these people are my friends and neighbors, and I want to really respect and take care of their history, of their legacy.
I think you did a terrific job of doing that. And other people of African descent who settled in Dawn, you write that they shouldn't be described as fugitives or refugees, but to see them like their white contemporaries as pioneers and founders. What did you mean by that?
Well, they played the same role in the community, and I think we've for too long seen them as something that wasn't somehow lesser, because the perception is that they were slaves who weren't here to contribute something, but rather to come and actually almost take something. The usual kind of narrative describes people of African descent as being people who came here kind of on the largesse of white people, where in fact, when you look at the whole Underground Railroad story, or even the settlement story that precedes that and follows after, that what you really see is people who are contributing, who have abilities, agency, that they're acting on the landscape, on the community, the same way that white pioneers did. And so that's just not a description that we've used to using when we've been so used to using the slavery to freedom narrative, where we talk about them as fugitives. And I hope that the language of this book changes that, that gets people to think about people of African descent who came in those early years differently.
And Afua, throughout this book, it's the first of a series of books exploring the history of this country. As you read this book, I know you're trying to define this authentic history of the people who were here. You learn about Black elite freemen who were part of that. I'm going to show you a picture, and Afua, if you can explain to us what we're looking here. Can you describe those images that we're seeing?
Well, we're seeing an image of a man with a sack over his back running. It's a kind of stereotypical image of the fugitive slave running away from slavery. And beside that image is a picture of a young woman, beautifully dressed in studio, in a photograph studio, having her picture taken, looking very refined. She is one of the a member of one of the families of this area. She's from the Whipper family.
Yes.
Right? So it really contrasts what we're talking about. Marie talked about, this image of the running fugitive running to Ontario and being looked after by white people, which wasn't the case. And then Miss Whipper there, beautifully dressed, educated, giving a different story, presenting a different narrative of the history of these people.
And in the book, we learned that Whipper is a family that's from Philadelphia.
From Pennsylvania.
From Pennsylvania, what you would call a black elite free man. Why was it important to challenge those stereotypical images?
It's important for a number of reasons. First, because we want to dispel this image of, of this picture of white largesse, that here are these poor, downtrodden fugitives rushing into Ontario and other provinces, and they can't help themselves, right? But we know, the Whippers were a black elite, certainly, but even people who were working class, who were ordinary people, who were farmers, were also helping themselves. It is not to say that, at the very... For example, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in the United States Congress, and there was a rush of African Americans, both enslaved and free, coming into the Canadian provinces. And, it was an emergency, so people needed help. Many people needed help. That's not to say, they didn't need help. There were people who needed help. If you think of today, when we have refugees coming into Canada, they're helped, they're given a purse, they're given a place to live. There are so many examples today. So the same thing then. But at the same time, there were groups of people who brought their own money, thousands of dollars sometimes, who came, who established farms, who lived in urban areas and established businesses. So we want to showcase the multidimensional nature of this experience.
I have another image to show you here. Marie, where was the Dawn settlement?
The thing is that we don't really know where the borders of the Dawn settlement are. Dawn was more of an idea than it was an actual place. But we do know that it was established when there was an area of Lambton County that still is Dawn Township. But over time, we lost track of that because in our area, it became Camden Gore. And so we've lost this idea of why the Dawn settlement was called Dawn, because it's been divorced from that geographic location. So my kind of rough estimate of it is that it was in this gore of Camden Township.
In the book, we also learn about the British American Institute. How was the Dawn settlement different from the British American Institute, Afua?
Well, the Dawn settlement itself was a town, was a settlement. The British American Institute was an industrial center or an industrial academy that was established to teach the manual arts to boys and also the domestic arts to girls. So it was an institute. Today we think of it, when you're in high school today, they say you go to shop, right? But it was one of the first manual institutes in all of the Canadian provinces. So it was really pioneering.
I'd like to explain to people that it's one of the constituent parts of the Dawn. It used to be considered that that was all of what Dawn was the institute, which was on about 300 acres. But what the research found through the mapping was that it's a much wider area than that.
Well, a name that keeps coming up throughout the book is Josiah Henson. Who was he, Afua?
Josiah Henson was an African-American man. He was enslaved in Maryland.
We have a picture of him?
Yes, he was enslaved in Maryland. He eventually escaped from slavery in Maryland with his family, wife and children, and came over to Upper Canada or to Ontario. He was first in Colchester, and then he went to the area we're talking about, the Dawn settlement, and established himself there. He was an anti-slavery advocate, an abolitionist. He actually also helped many people to escape from slavery from United States into Canada. But he became a sort of patriarch of Dawn and wrote his autobiography And when he wrote his autobiography, I think maybe there's Josiah Henson before the autobiography and Josiah Henson after the autobiography, because the autobiography blew him up, as we say in today's language. He blew up.
He became very famous.
He became very famous. It is said that Harriet Beecher Stowe modeled her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Uncle Tom in the cabin title, on Josiah Henson. And it is true, she did read his book. She, you know, took a lot of liberties with the narrative, and she blew up too. She became hugely, hugely famous and very wealthy as a result of that. Finally, Josiah Henson also went to the World's Fair in London and took some lumber from Ontario in the area where he was. He met Queen Victoria, and also that added to his fame. He was a larger-than-life figure, so we can say abolitionist, author, freedom fighter, and resident of the area that we're talking about. And maybe I'm sure Marie has more on Josiah Henson.
I know you
she's done
both
all the work on him.
So not to speak out of turn, because one of the things about reading this book, you do additional research on the side.
Yeah.
Is it too much to say that his story played a role in the free slavery being ended in America?
Well, you know, according to Abraham Lincoln, Mrs. Stowe was the woman who fired the first shot in the Civil War because of her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So millions of people read that book and were apparently swayed to the abolitionist cause, even though there were some very stereotypical tropes in her book. You know, she presented this Uncle Tom as an Uncle Tom. And that's why today the name of the museum is changed, because Josiah Henson certainly was no Uncle Tom.
Can you explain what an Uncle Tom is?
So an Uncle Tom, it's a black person who sort of licks the boots of white people, who is very subservient, who says yes to everything, and who will sell out members of his or her race. I suppose a woman can be an Uncle Tom too. So over the years after, because Mrs. Stowe presents this figure in her book as really subservient, as really kind of leave it to God, don't really fight the power. And Josiah Henson was not that person. He fought the power. He was a strong black man. He was an abolitionist. So, you know, she has that stereotypical image of this man in her book. At the same time, though, when the millions of people who read that book, I would suppose that many of them, their hearts were moved towards to the anti-slavery cause, and really how engendered a huge conversation on the anti-slavery movement, or on the wrongs or rights of slavery. And there was a time many people are saying, well, this is wrong. Eventually there was a civil war. So that's why Lincoln said she fired, Mrs. Stowe fired the first shot. But the thing is, Don, many people, thousands and thousands of people contributed to that cause and to the eventual ending of slavery. It was enslaved people themselves. They had the agency. They fought. They ran away. They wrote their autobiographies, people like Mr. Henson. So it wasn't just one person. It was a collective.
We know that it was a very violent time, and trust was something that, you know, between if you were a free person running away from slavery, at any time you could become enslaved again. How were freed slaves who escaped to Dresden able to trust white abolitionists? Marie?
I think there was a partnership of sorts with some of the abolitionists that were there. I think the book I tried to show, too, where we had some very committed white abolitionists that were there and white people who were against segregation. Reverend Thomas Hughes is one of my favorite characters in the book, one of my heroes. He founded the British Colonial Church and School Society's mission to the slaves there. And he actually left a very comfortable life in England when he was in his 40s and came with his family to Dresden and founded this mission. And he really championed the cause of desegregation in Dresden.
I wanted to read a letter to just give everybody at home a sense of what was happening at that time. And this is a letter of the death of Mrs. Jackson. Mrs. Jackson, a lady of intelligence and piety, was last spring on her way from Chatham to Detroit. She took passage in the steamer Brothers, which plies between these places. The weather being cold and stormy and her health very poor, she went into the cabin and the captain came in immediately and drove her out, and she had to sit on deck in cold winds, heavy rains, and dashing waves from 7 o'clock in the morning till late at night. She took cold and in a few days was no more. Her physicians say prejudice was the cause of her death. Was this letter representative of the times?
I don't know what you say is how you determine what's representative, because I think you get in any time period this range of attitudes, a range of responses to people. So I think one of the mistakes we make is by trying to oversimplify some of these things or boil them down to one passage. And I think what I tried to do in the book was to give a very nuanced account that shows a lot of different responses to the new people that were moving into the neighborhood, and also showing their response in return. And one of the amazing things to me was that there was this whole network of transportation that was developed by the freedmen themselves, where they had their own hotels, had their own transportation systems like stages. There was a daily stage from Chatham to Dresden, which I never knew this before. It absolutely amazed me to see this whole system developing.
I think that also happened during the Civil Rights Movement with a Green Book, where people would document what hotels were safe to stay at, what roads to take. I have another picture from the book. It says, "Men of color to arms, if we wish to be free in this land, if we would be regarded men, if we would forever silence the tongue of calamity, of prejudice and hate, let us rise now and fly to arms." Afua, why were African descendant residents of Dawn's settlement inclined to enlist in the American Civil War?
In many ways, they saw it as their war. It was a war to help their brethren, the families that they had there in the United States who were enslaved. So that's one. Second reason was that they felt that they would be successful, that the Union Army would win the war, and that being the case, then slavery would be abolished, would be expunged from the North American continent, because the British had abolished slavery earlier in 1834. So they didn't feel that they could just sit back and just watch the war go on. They wanted to participate. They wanted to help. They wanted to die for freedom.
But even if
a very personal thing.
Even if it was personal, and even if they were sacrificing, they still had a lot of barriers to overcome. I just wanted to read another passage from the book. African descent soldiers face the same, or at times even greater perils than their white counterparts. If captured, they were often harshly treated by the Confederates, and in some cases, tortured to death. Rates of disease for black soldiers were also appreciably higher than for white soldiers. Of the 190,000 who served, 40,000 would die, with 30,000 of those deaths being from infection or disease. Their service, however, would not be equitably rewarded. After the harsh conditions of serving during the American Civil War, these men, black men, also enlisted in World War I just a few years later. How come?
I think there's a great deal of pride, among the black population. And I think the passage you read from, and it's actually from Frederick Douglass, who said the to arms quote. And within that was this whole idea of manhood, to prove that they were truly men. And I think that whole elevation of the race, to be able to see people as being equal to their white counterparts, to be real contributors in ways that required sacrifice, was something very much on their minds when they were saying this.
Dresden, Ontario eventually, and the Dawn settlement eventually become gateways to immigration across Ontario for freed people of African descent. How did this come about?
Dawn is one of the places that they came. I think we have a lot of different places across Ontario where they did come through. This is not a unique story to Dresden. I think we have a lot of communities who probably find these same stories. Windsor would be a major crossing from Detroit, the Niagara area. And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to say in the light of Dawn is that this is a story that everybody needs to dig into further, needs to look at and say, how does this apply to my community? How is my community a gateway? How is my community part of this international exchange that went back and forth, not just one way into Canada, but that a lot of these people were going also back to the United States and helping with the cause there.
Well, something that was unique in Dresden, schools were integrated in the 1880s. Afua, how did a move like this compare to other settlements and towns across Canada and the U.S.?
I think in the 1880s, across the Canadian provinces, there was some integration, but not everywhere, because even remember that the last segregated school in Ontario closed in 1964. But in the 1880s, there was a civil rights movement, if you will, in education in southwestern Ontario to integrate the schools. So the schools were integrated in Dresden and in Chatham, but not everywhere. In Nova Scotia, the schools remained segregated until 1983. There were segregated schools in Alberta and Saskatchewan way after that date. Well, people could say, well, you know, Saskatchewan and Alberta weren't part of Canada in 1883, but nonetheless, in the 20th century, the schools were segregated there. So it's not a triumphant story. It's not a story of success, because segregation for the Black community was a fact of life. In Toronto, the schools were not segregated, by the way, but in some of the schools, the benches were segregated. They would put the Black kids on benches separate from the white kids. So it's a story of struggle. We all love to say it's a story of resilience and resistance, but the fact remains that that's why we say racism is structural and systemic, that within these structures, education, entertainment, the economic situation, these structures were really stacked against Black people. And so Black people had to fight really hard.
Yeah, it goes beyond just someone. It goes beyond just people being called names.
Yeah.
And even one of the things that shocked me about this book was that we know this happened in the U.S. where mobs would burn Black towns.
Yeah.
The fact that that also happened here, to me, was kind of shocking.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left. Marie, can you tell me about Reverend Jenny Johnson and all the moves that she made?
Oh, that's an amazing story, because her life really straddles a time period that is really fascinating, because she knew Reverend Josiah Henson and yet lived into a time when Reverend Martin Luther King was giving his speeches. And so you see this whole continuum playing out in her lifetime of how these things from slavery were connected to our modern times in such a short period of time. Jenny is an amazing woman, because she was the first ordained minister in Canada, not just the first ordained Black minister, female minister, but the first female minister. Dr. Nina Marie Moroney did a really excellent biography on her, if people want to know more about her. But within the book, I tried to at least highlight her role, especially during the time of the Great Migration that happened in the United States. And she ended up going to Flint, Michigan to help with the Great Migration, but came back to Dresden to try to advocate for the establishment of what is now the Josiah Henson Museum.
We only have 1 more minute, and I just wanted to point out that reading this book, you get a sense of the role that multiculturalism played before it became government policy before Canada. You had Black people living with white people. I know that you said that this history you want to create an authentic history and one that shows the path towards people understanding the contributions of all the people. Was that the thing that drove you to write this book?
Yes, I think too, I wanted to write it for my neighbors and my friends. I've never seen my community in the way that I've seen it portrayed in other places. A lot of the Don's history didn't seem to match what I experienced as a child growing up. And so I really wanted to present a history that would show more nuance, more of the diversity, more of the interplay between black and white and indigenous people. That was a part of the reality of that time and place, and through my lifetime too.
And Afua, can you explain to us, this book is the first of a series of other books?
Yes, this book is the first of the Henry and Mary Bay book series. Henry and Mary Bay were abolitionists from the Windsor area who founded Canada's black press with their newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive, in 1851. And so it's with the series, is with the University of Regina Press. This is the first, and we will have other publications in the Henry and Mary Bay book series, Black History, a book series. So we're highlighting the Black history of Canada with this series.
We're so grateful that you both made time for us. We've learned so much from this book, and I recommend that we all have an opportunity to read from it, because we just never stop learning, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Nam.
Yep.
And that is the agenda for Friday, February 14th, 2025. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. And to those of you watching from Mississauga, happy 104th birthday to your late former mayor, Hazel McCallion. Now, we want to remind you to tune in to the Ontario Leaders Debate this Monday, February 17th at 6:30 p.m. right here on TVO. And we'll have all the details in the onpoli podcast on Tuesday. The agenda is preempted on Monday, but we'll be back the next day for reactions to the debate and much more. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again on Tuesday.